Hola, mi nombre es Katie Williamson, Katita Williamson. Yo soy Nutritional Therapy Practitioner, terapeuta nutricional y también SPN, especialista en nutrición prenatal. Hoy día les tengo un gran regalo. Es una entrevista que grabé con Kate Deering. Kate es la autora de un libro maravilloso. Hablamos del libro en la entrevista. Una de las metas que tengo para este canal y para mi proyecto Yo Soy Pachamista es traducir información de mi idioma materno, el inglés, al español. Hay mucha información que me gusta compartir y hacerlo más accesible al mundo hispanohablante. Entonces, ojalá que te tomes un tiempo hoy para mirar la entrevista completa y tomar notas es muy útil. Y si te interesan estos temas de la dieta prometabólica, de la nutrición bioenergética, te invito a mirar mi curso de preparación para la concepción. Este año 2025 solo lo hacemos una vez. Es un curso grande, es un rezo por la vida. Hay parejas que quieren concebir dentro del curso, hay mujeres que no quieren concebir, pero quieren optimizar su salud reproductiva, hay mujeres que ya han pasado por el portal de la menopausia y quieren estar en el curso para poder aprender más sobre la salud y ayudar a las mujeres en su linaje. Entonces, si te gusta esta entrevista y quieres aprender más sobre este tipo de alimentación y este estilo de vida, te invito a mirar el link de la página de inscripción de mi curso Preparación para la Concepción. Te dejo el enlace debajo de este video y nos vemos. Yo también mando correos interesantes. Me gusta mucho escribir. Creo que escribo mejor en español que hablo. Entonces, si quieres suscribirte a mi página, yosepachamista.com, puedes recibir mis correos y mando información muy, muy interesante una vez a la semana, quizás dos veces. Entonces, por ahí también nos vemos. Muchas gracias por tu presencia y disfruta mucho esta entrevista con Kate Deering. Bye bye. Hi, and welcome to the Yo Soy Pachamamista YouTube channel. Today we have Kate Deering with us. I am so excited to have you here, Kate. Kate is the author of this spectacular book called How to Heal Your Metabolism. And one of my biggest dreams would be if this book was translated into Spanish, because this book offers a perspective on nutrition that's a lot different from what we hear in the current functional medicine space that talks a lot about fat being good and protein being good and kind of demonizes carbs. And so today we're going to talk about what does pro-metabolic nutrition mean, or bioenergetic nutrition, and how do we eat for our metabolism? How do we heal our metabolism, as Kate's book is called? Kate, thank you so much for your time. This is very amazing for all of the Yo Soy Pachamista community and anyone that is a Spanish speaker that might not have been exposed to your work previously. I want to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself. And I know your story is probably long, but to talk a little bit about how you arrived to be who you are today. And I would say you are a leader in this pro-metabolic nutrition space. So welcome. And who are you?
Well, thank you for that, Katie. Pleasure to be here. I have been in this space for probably close to 15 or 16 years now. I've been in the health field for most of my adult life, so a good 30 plus years. And I have done everything, right? And I've trained, I've done nutritional coaching, and I've gone through all the spectrums of how I've taught people to get healthy. And a lot of them usually resulted around a lower carb diet because that usually resulted in the most amount of weight loss initially. And that was always kind of where my mindset was. If I can get you to lose weight, and I think that's where a lot of people's mindset is. If we just need to get you to lose weight, then you'll become healthier and all will be right in the world. And as I started to get older into my later 30s, and I kept trying to kind of fit into that mold, exercise more, eat cleaner, or eat less, or be more restrictive, it felt like it became harder and harder and harder and harder. And I felt like I was starting to become symptomatic and didn't know what was happening. I guess I was just thinking that I guess I'm turning 40 and maybe this is the way it goes. That's when I was presented with the work of Dr. Ray Peat, which obviously all of this is kind of based on his work and a few other people that kind of align to trying to improve energy metabolism. And it kind of flipped everything upside down for me because it was all about paying attention to your body temperature and your heat production and how are you sleeping? How do you feel through the day? Do you have aches and pains? And are you able to maintain your weight without excessive exercise and restrictive eating? And I read all those and I was like, I am a no on all of those. I was cold. I was having sleep issues. I was having hormonal issues, digestive issues. I looked good. And that is kind of the mirage that's in the fitness industry. A lot of people look good, but internally they do have a lot of other issues. And so what I was finding is I was kind of teaching people this way that for myself, what not even realizing it, I was kind of hitting a lot of stumbling and a lot of health issues. So when I jumped into this, as what many people do, is they kind of change everything in like 1 second. So I went from like a low carb approach, not eating any sort of saturated fat, not eating any sort of dairy, and then all of a sudden eating tons of sugar, tons of fruit, tons of dairy, and everything just switched. And I will tell you that that was probably not the best way to go into this. Slow and steady wins the race. But what I did find over time is that my health totally shifted and things that I had been struggling with literally my entire life, meaning I had always been into like willpower and restriction. And, I can stay fit and lean as long as I am like hanging on and doing everything I can and, not eating these foods and so forth. And when I started to actually fuel my systems appropriately and give my systems enough carbohydrates so that they could actually take care of themselves, a lot of these things that I'd been feeling my entire life just went away. Meaning I never was having sugar cravings anymore. Meaning my sleep was so much easier. Meaning I didn't have like bouts of like anxiety or feeling like my system was just on hyperdrive. And and the deeper I dove into it, it just made me help me understand that how carbs are so influential and how important they are for someone to have a healthy running metabolism. And I would like to say healthy because a lot of people, I mean, we can use high metabolism interchangeably on some level, but people can burn a lot of calories and not have a healthy metabolism. They can just have a very stressed metabolism. You can burn a lot of calories being in a high adrenaline cortisol state, and people kind of confuse that with, oh, I have a high metabolism, but those people usually are really symptomatic. So it's not the same thing. So I want to go into, I learned to kind of support my system on a healthy level so that my body could function optimally, so that I could have a good cycle, so that I could sleep appropriate, so I didn't have to train 2 hours a day, 7 days a week to maintain some level of crazy fitness level. I could reduce that and still stay quite healthy. And that became a lot easier to live. And I didn't have to now wrap my entire mind and literally personality and everything around this ideal of what I think I should be, which it's really not doable unless you become obsessive about it, which isn't healthy.
Okay, you said so many things, and I was like, bing, bing, bing. I could go in 20 directions right now. Okay, what I think where I'll come from is because you mentioned being in your late 30s and being like, wow, the things I was doing before aren't working for me anymore. And I'll say from my own experience, I feel like at age, I'm 36, almost 37. So at age 34 for me, so a little bit younger, is when I was like, whoa, something has changed. Something is different. For most of my life up until 34, I think that people would describe me as a really energetic person, but it was a stressed based energy. And at 34 is when my body in particular said, oh, you can't derive your stress from, or excuse me, you can't derive your energy from stress because you're literally burnt out completely. And so this is really important. And today's talk isn't just for women, it's for men as well. But I do think that what we're speaking about really does affect women in particular. And wow, wouldn't it have been amazing if I had known these things in my 20s and maybe I wouldn't have like reached a burnout point at age 34. But okay, maybe we'll talk about that. Okay, I'm trying to think about where I want to start with this. Maybe we'll define metabolism and talk about what a healthy metabolism is and how that manifests versus like you said, a high metabolism, someone who's thin and obviously burning calories and not putting in weight, but truly stressed out on all levels, mentally, emotionally, and physiologically. So maybe we go there. What is a healthy metabolism and how does it manifest in the body? How can we measure that? And then what is that state of being like versus what I just described me up until age 34?
Yes, the basics are a good question, right? It is what is a metabolism essentially? So we can define it a few different ways. We can define it as how well your body is converting the food that you consume into actual energy. And I think what some people mistake is that the human body actually doesn't run on food. It runs on how well you can convert that food into energy, or the human body's energy currency is ATP or adenosine triphosphate. It is that energy that we produce that runs our systems. And so if we don't produce energy well for whatever reason, even if we eat the right food, we might not produce energy effectively, then the systems aren't going to run effectively. So the food is certainly important, but also how well you're converting it into energy is equally important. And so we kind of have to know that's a huge part of it. We can also define metabolism as like the sum of every metabolic process that's going on in your body. Meaning, when we think about metabolism, it's like how many calories are we using in the day to keep our body healthy? And so we consume or use calories to run all our internal systems, our digestive system, our circulatory nervous system, breathing. Everything requires energy. The internal systems that we utilize, we refer to as your basal metabolic rate. So that's just the amount of energy that we need to just keep our systems running when we're doing nothing. And then we have other things like actually our digestion and absorption. We call that the thermic effect of food. So it's the amount of energy it takes for us to break our food down, because our food doesn't break down on its own. Then we, of course, have what we refer to as NEAT, or your non-exercise activity. It's the things that you're just doing all day long, like grocery shopping or working. And that all takes energy to do. And then, of course, you have your exercise. And those basic four components would take up how much energy do you need to do all those things healthfully. And if you're producing enough energy to keep up with all of those demands, then we would refer to you as you're being in energy balance, or you're in homeostatic point, because your body's able to keep up with all of that. And that would be considered a healthy metabolism, because you are able to keep up with all of those demands. We would consider it a stressed metabolism when all of a sudden the demands become higher than the body is able to produce energy for effectively. Meaning, if you all of a sudden become really stressed out, or you start training for a marathon, or you put some additional load on your system, but you don't consume enough food that could keep up with turning into energy to do that, then we would have to go into a stressed system. And when you go into a stress system, the body then has to use you and the resources that you have, whether it's your muscle tissue, body fat, nutrients you have on there, bone, whatever. We have to break down components of you to keep up with that additional demand. And we would refer to that essentially as a weight loss. Right? What most people don't understand is weight loss in itself is stressful to the human body on some level. Certainly if you force it to an excessive amount. If you do it quite slowly, it isn't assumed as that stressful, but it is some level of stress, because you have to be in some level of deficit for you to have some sort of weight loss. And so it's this combination of trying to figure out how do we produce a weight loss, or how do we stay healthy and still probably produce and not stress the crap out of our system to do that. And so it's kind of managing that. And so from our perspective, the goal should always be to initially try to produce as much energy as possible. Meaning, we want to make sure your system's working in all cylinders before we even put you into a weight loss perspective or stress your system more. Because if we don't, then we're kind of taking from Peter to pay Paul. We're going to take from, the energy that your body needs to run all its systems, a digestive system, hormonal system, or whatever, to kind of keep up with the stressors in your life. And I think getting back to like when women specifically hit their 30s or late 30s, like I did, we're probably also hitting that time in our life would be considered perimenopause, that women become more sensitive to stress at that point. And also, yes, their eggs start to run out and their cycle becomes a little bit irregular, But what I have found is that women, particularly in today's world, are being pulled in 85 different directions. And because essentially they don't do well at these points anymore because their body can't maintain a level of homeostasis any longer. And then they add in something like irregularities to their cycle, and it just totally throws them over. And probably in hindsight, looking back, that was probably something that I was experiencing, was very unaware that that was going on because I was eating restrictively and trying to do way too much, and I was totally out of balance. So it made that perimenopausal experience a lot more challenging until I got myself into a better balance. Is that hopefully answering the question?
Yes, that's a spectacular answer. And okay. What's interesting when I look back on my own experience, and I'm saying this because I think it's the experience of a lot of women, is that I was actually eating well. I had been exposed to the work of Weston A. Price a long time ago and was eating, organ meats and grass-fed beef and, organic fruit and raw milk. And so I was eating what we would call well, but I was not eating enough. I really had no idea of what it truly takes to fuel my body. Because you mentioned before, like there are so many things happening in your body, even if you didn't exercise, just sitting around,
Mm-hmm.
sleeping, like life is a high energy state. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's very stressful not to eat enough,
Mm-hmm.
and so many women don't eat. I would say people in general, but definitely women don't eat enough, which is so fascinating because the narrative that we're told is like, well, modern people overeat. We're just a bunch of like, hogs, pigs that are just just eating so much, and we have so many access to calories, and we're overeating. But I don't think that's the case. What do you think?
Well, I do think there's
Yes.
probably some people that are over consuming for sure,
Right.
right? And probably when I look at the things, so I usually break it down to there's four main things that make up like how well your metabolism works. It's your food quality or your fuel quality, and your fuel should be primarily carbohydrates or fats. So you need good carbs and fats to help facilitate a good, well-running metabolism. Then you need optimal nutrients, right? And I put vitamins, minerals, and I actually put protein in as a nutrient. All those are needed. And if we're deficient in any of those, the entire system to produce energy can slow down. And so, if you're deficient in B vitamins, well, we can slow down. Now, certainly like the Weston Price diet, it had a certain level of nutrition in it, but let's just say you have a decent amount of nutrition, but there's just not enough fuel coming in because you're not eating enough carbohydrates or you're just not eating enough calories. Well, that's going to hinder the process because we're lacking one of our major components. And then the two other things that are needed is you do need oxygen. That's why you breathe. But some
Mhm.
people, they maybe are anemic. Maybe they're B12 deficient. Maybe they're iron deficient. Maybe they just have poor breathing patterns because they've been sitting and hunched over all day long and they're not completely taking a breath in. And if we have poor oxygen inhalation, then the oxygen that we need to go in and help our cells kind of manufacture energy becomes deficient. Um, Most people don't understand that the entire reason you're actually breathing is so that you can bring oxygen to the cell and actually help facilitate energy production. That's it. That's why you breathe. And if oxygen doesn't get delivered to the cell to facilitate energy production, then energy production stops. And that's when life ends, right? Because then the cells die and then you die, right? And that's why you breathe, right? And that's super, super important. And there's just so many mechanics of breath that could play a role in that. And then the fourth thing that you need is thyroid and thyroid production and conversion. Thyroid is needed within the cell to basically tell the cell to produce more energy if you need it. And all of those things, if any of them are deficient, then you could lack in how well you're turning the food into energy. So for instance, and I know you've talked to Jay on here, and Jay kind of chats about this in the sense of if we eat a certain amount of calories, because I think back in probably the 1920s, if we looked at what the average person ate, they might have eaten actually more calories than we are eating in today's world. Um, at the same time, we are also probably more physically active back then as well. So that's certainly going to play a part. And certainly the foods that we're eating now are way different than what we were eating back in the 1920s. So now we have highly processed food. So maybe we're eating 3,000 calories, but they're lacking in nutrition. And maybe they're having a bunch of polyunsaturated fat or seed oils in there that basically can inhibit cellular respiration. So we're eating things that are slowing down our energy production system. So we're actually hindering our body's ability to produce energy. And so instead of making ATP, we just end up storing a bunch of it. So we actually gain weight on less calories. And so that certainly can be a component. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to like say that everyone's doing that. There's certainly people just eating way too much because they're eating highly palatable, fast, ultra processed foods, and they're eating way too much and they're not doing anything. And that's a problem. But then there's other people that maybe, and I know you see that too, that I see people that don't actually eat a lot. And yet, if they eat anywhere over like 14 or 1,500 calories, they tend to gain weight. And so it's a tendency of we have to shift and change the mechanism of how we're kind of delivering the food to them and how that food is being processed. And that's when we have to make better food choices and kind of implement things very slow and steady that their body can adjust to maybe a new calorie intake.
Yeah, I think definitely in the health space, there's people that are not eating enough. And um it's very interesting because with children, we are so we're so happy when they're hungry. We recognize that having a good appetite is healthy, but in adults, it's kind of it switches, right? People kind of brag about, well, I don't get hungry till I'm one. I mean, I don't get hungry until 1 o'clock, or I don't have to eat breakfast. Like I can just drink a cup of coffee and I'll be fine until lunchtime or whatever. Or I only eat one meal a day, or I intermittent fast. And so it's interesting that we kind of at some point, maybe in adolescence, I'm not sure, but the script kind of changes from, wow, having an appetite is a sign of health versus in adults. I don't really see anybody, I mean, besides a few voices in this pro-metabolic space, but kind of actually saying out loud, having an appetite is a sign of health, even in
Well,
adults.
100%, right. And it is. And because so many of these dietary approaches that are out there now tend to work in a kind of a stress system, right? If you remove all carbohydrates, then the body is literally going through gluconeogenesis, which is basically turning non-carbohydrate sources into glucose because you can't live without glucose. So if you go zero carb, you have to make your own at this point in time. And so the way you do that is through a process called gluconeogenesis, and that is activated by stress hormones. And so basically, then you have a low level of stress hormones just circulating through you at all times. And stress hormones can literally kill your appetite. So a lot of people like that. Initially, they're using it as a tool. They're like, I want to lose weight. It's easier for me to lose weight if I don't have an appetite, which is true. Right. And so that they have managed to eat less then, and then they lose weight. And then that is what they're looking to do. And some can continue to do something like that or they might slowly, increase carbohydrates later on and they can just use it as a tool to lose weight. But most end up not being able to sustain those kind of dietary approaches. They're challenging to sustain. Or normally what happens is they go through a very stressful experience on those type of diets and then can fall completely off and like crash into a wall and get run over by a car 17 times because it feels horrible at that point because they can't keep up with the stress demands on their body. And the most important fuel source when you're under stress is having enough carbohydrates because that's what your body's looking for. And so if you aren't giving your body any, your body just continues to break down tissue or will break down protein to make its own. And that has a cost associated with it.
So some people, no matter what you say about this topic of carbs, they'll go back to, well, carbs are not ancestral because they're pretty new and, we were hunters and gatherers, but maybe the gathering part was just some greens that didn't provide much starch or much sugar or whatever, and, some berries in the summer. And so, yeah, there's still quite a bit of people that talk about, well, carbs aren't necessarily ancestral.
Mm.
What would you say to that crowd?
Well, usually the ancestors they're referring to are usually dead by 30. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm not sure the sign of a long life, right? Our ancestors back then did not live long lives. So there's that. There's also, the life was very different then, right? Their lives were like, we sleep all day. We went to bed at dark, right? And then we were up just with the sunlight, and maybe we ate a big slab of meat, and that would, but the level of stress that you're inundated in today's world is way different than it was back in the day, of our ancestors. And of course, there's lots of ancestral diets that are very carb centric, right? Not all of them. We have many areas of the world that had very different dietary approaches. And so not all of them were doing that. But if all we did all day long was lay around, and then I would eventually go out and kill a boar, and I would lay around for a week or whatever, and it was like a big community, we were all sitting around, and we weren't out jogging and on the internet all day and doing crazy stuff, then you might be and do fine on a fat and protein diet, because you're living at a lower level of stress. And when we are at a lower stress level, we can use fat just fine. It's a slower fuel source, and so we can just use it, and we don't need a lot of carbohydrates at that point in time. But now in modern world, where we are literally running from a lion 24/7 because we're in the internet, and there's EMFs, and there's pollutants in our water and our food, and we're not eating enough, and then we got to go work out, and then we had a fight with it, right? It's ongoing. And so it's a different sort of atmosphere in today's world. And your nervous system runs best with carbohydrates. Certainly, it can make, or your body will make ketones if need be to kind of sub in there. But you always need some level of glucose. And in today's world, you will need more because of just the level of stress that you're under. But I'm not saying that people can't get away with it. In certain cultures, you probably can. I don't think there's any evidence anywhere that shows there's a long living culture that didn't eat carbohydrates. There's not one, right? So we don't have any evidence that a carb fat diet is going to keep you alive for a long period of time. Can your ancestors have been successful with it until they were 30? Sure. Could they have been successful with the kind of environment that they were living in? 100%. Was it going to keep them alive to 100 successfully? No evidence of that.
Hola, si estás disfrutando de esta entrevista y dices, wow, quiero aprender más, quiero entender más, quiero tener información en videos y recetas y también información escrita y lo quiero en español, bueno, entonces te invito a mirar mi curso de preparación para la concepción. Es muy grande, son 6 meses, es un contenedor súper bonito y también muy íntimo. Nos conocemos muy bien porque estamos juntos durante 6 meses. No es como cualquier curso en línea que compras y lo haces y no conoces a las personas en el grupo. O sea, lo ideal es siempre estar en persona, ¿no? Tocándonos y viéndonos, ¿no? Pero también, o sea, si no podemos estar en vivos juntos, podemos estar digitalmente reunidos y conocernos bien y tener una comunidad. Entonces te invito a mirar el enlace y si no te interesa el curso, por favor, manda el enlace a alguien en tu vida que podría beneficiarse de esa información en el curso. Bueno, gracias y disfruta la entrevista. Bye. Oh, the things we'll do for sugar, like I watched a National Geographic about these people that had, were harvesting from wild beehives on the side of a mountain and the cliff. And I was like, wow, oh, the things we'll do for sugar. Or this year is my first year tapping maple trees.
Mm.
And I'm like, oh, the things we'll do for sugar. Like, so humans have always valued sweetness.
Mhm.
And we've always valued carbs. There's a book, Sally Fallon, who founded the Weston A. Price Foundation and wrote Nourishing Traditions, which is the cookbook that most people know. She actually wrote another book called Nourishing Diets, which I like the most because it kind of dispels the myth that our ancestors were all just like sitting around eating chunks of meat. Like, I
Mhm.
mean, it does depend on where, like you said, it totally depends on our geography and climate. But I think we definitely made it a point to seek out sugar, i.e.
Mhm.
carbs. So,
Mhm.
and carbs, sugar, glucose is the brain's preferred fuel source.
Correct. Mhm. And it's
Mhm.
the only fuel source that your red blood cells can utilize. right? Your red blood cells don't have any mitochondria in them. So they have to use glucose. They cannot use another fuel source. So you have trillions of red blood cells, and all the hemoglobin molecules in there need glucose. And so if you don't have it, guess what? Then oxygen does not get transported through your body. And it makes sense that you would not use like cellular respiration to keep a like a hemoglobin molecule or red blood cell alive, because its job is to carry oxygen. So you don't want it to need oxygen because you want it to carry the oxygen, right? All other
Right.
cells will require oxygen at the end, basically as the final electron acceptor, or it's needed to kind of keep things moving. Whereas your red blood cells do not need that because they're in like a glycolytic space to produce energy. So if you don't have glucose, if you go to zero glucose, then you can't transport oxygen, and again, you die. So it's super important, and that's why you do need it. And certainly there's people like, well, you only need this much or that much or whatnot. You know, you only have a teaspoon in your blood at one time. I'm like, well, who cares what you have in one time, right? You're constantly using it. So it's like relevant to me. You're needing it all day long. And certainly the level of activity that you're in could certainly increase it. The level of stress you're in can certainly increase that. But, and again, I'm not saying you can't get by on a fat protein diet for a period of time, but I've just never seen anybody, and I've worked with a ton of people coming off a keto or carnivore diet, and they have been really successful for other reasons. Like if they went in there to help heal their gut, seen it be very successful for things like that. But for long-term success, it does seem to have a negative effect, or start to have a negative effect within 2, 3, 4 years, and all of a sudden they have other problems.
Right. Exactly. So a lot of the people that come on as influencers of a low carb or zero carb or keto or carnivore diet, um, they don't they probably don't realize that it is a short-term solution. It's just a door that you walk through potentially, or maybe not, but it's potentially a door that you walk through for a short amount of time to get to somewhere else.
Mhm.
And but I do think that it's interesting in the last couple of years, because Dr. Ray Peat's work has gotten way more widespread. Like a lot of those, particularly male
Mhm.
influencers or biohackers, are now totally kind of shifting into a more Ray Peat right mindset. I think it was Danny Roddy on a video from maybe like 2 months ago or something said all roads lead to Ray Peat, because because eventually you realize you realize with restrictive diets that um the body is seeking safety and not survival. Like the body longs to be safe and not to live in a stressed, always like on the edge of survival all the time.
Mhm. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think we can go into those spaces, right? I think our body is designed to go through stressful experiences, and it can withstand that, certainly when it's healthy. It's just not designed to stay in there forever. You know, these pathways to produce energy in a stress state can work, but they will always come at a cost. And the cost is usually lowering your internal functions or lowering your basal metabolic rate, which results in things like slower digestion, poor hormone function. This is when you see women that have really horrible periods. You see infertility. You see it's hard to gain muscle. You see brain fog. You see cold bodies, um, body temperatures that are usually below 98.6. There's a lot of things that can be connected to your metabolism not functioning optimally, or your ability to produce energy isn't working very efficiently. Because how well you produce energy is how well your body's going to work. And so instead of just isolating certain things and saying, well, I'm just going to fix my cycle or my period or whatever, if we just work on, well, what if we just improve your energy production and stabilize your system? Would that improve that? And usually the answer is yes, it will, because everything again is running on energy. And if you can produce more of it effectively, you'll have more available to run the systems of your body.
Yeah. So improving energy production is a synonym of improving metabolism, which is a synonym of improving thyroid function, right?
Could be sort of. They're certainly interconnected. Improving thyroid production or conversion is going to improve metabolism. But if you increase or improve metabolism, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to improve thyroid function. Meaning your thyroid function could be totally fine, and you could have a crappy metabolism, right? Meaning maybe you're producing thyroid totally fine, but maybe your food quality is really bad, or maybe you don't have enough nutrition. And those things, if they aren't proper, then they will have an adaptive response to your thyroid, which will make it lower, right? So stress, anything stressful, will inherently suppress thyroid function. Does it mean you need thyroid hormone, or does it mean there's something wrong with your thyroid? No, it just means that something is suppressing it. And so instead of looking at thyroid directly, maybe we're like, well, wait, what if we take some of the stress off you and give you better food? And then your thyroid will be like, oh, now we can work properly because now we have the right resources.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. Okay, we'll definitely go into thyroid supplementation, et cetera, because that's a big topic. Actually, let's do that now because it's very common for someone to go in for a thyroid test. If you go to a conventional doctor, you're going to get just TSH, which we know is a pituitary hormone, not a thyroid hormone. If you go to a functional medicine doctor, you're probably going to get a full thyroid panel. But either way, it's very common that you receive the news that your thyroid is fine and you don't have a thyroid issue, but you've got these symptoms of my body's cold, my circulation is poor, I'm sluggish, I have brain fog, I'm not putting muscle on, I feel depressed, I just have a cold, slow, sad body. And so 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 in your book, what you talk about, and what Ray Peat talks about as well, are measuring both body temperature and pulse as a way to measure yourself and collect data on yourself about how your overall metabolism and thyroid function is going. So, if someone wanted to do that, what would they do?
Okay. Yeah. So let's kind of just specify like your thyroid, which is this little butterfly organ in your neck. Um, it makes your thyroid hormones. It makes your T4 and your T3 primarily. And those hormones are needed within, or at least T3 specifically. So you make T4, which is inactive, and it's 80 to 90% T4, and then you make T3, which is about 10%, and that's the active thyroid. That's the one that does the magic. That's the one that gets into your cell and basically tells your cell what to do. And it also tells your mitochondria to, hey, speed up and make more energy. We need more. And so it's a really good hormone. And so when a doctor, whether functional or medical, checks thyroid labs, certainly you're right. The first one they will check is your thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, which is a pituitary hormone, to see if your pituitary is talking to the thyroid. Because if it's elevated, it says, hey, it's saying you're not producing enough thyroid, so we're going to tell the TSH to continue to elevate until we get enough in there. So we can tell if someone has really elevated TSH that they would be hypothyroid, that maybe their thyroid actually is not producing enough thyroid hormone. And for those people, they may very well need to be on an exogenous thyroid hormone because their thyroid is literally not working for whatever reason, right? So other people might go and get a full thyroid panel and they're like, my TSH is fine. And they check their free T3 and free T4 and they're like, well, they're in range. And so they're like, I'm still having all these symptoms. Now, what we have to remember is go back to our energy equation. There are those four main components that can hinder energy production: the food, carbs or fats, the nutrients, oxygenation, and thyroid. And any one of those things, if we're lacking, will result in the same symptoms: cold body, poor digestion, right? Whatever. They all look like a slow metabolism. It could be the thyroid is the reason, meaning it could be you're not making enough thyroid, and that's why it's all slow. So that is certainly one place to look. But it could also be that you just don't have the right nutrients, because you do need tons of nutrients, for your thyroid to actually go through thyroid conversion, and you need tons to actually facilitate energy production. And if any of those are low, then that could be the thing that's backing up the whole system.
Mhm.
So thyroid is one place to go, and it is interconnected, because I would say it's kind of the CEO of the cell. It's the one telling everyone what to do. And so it's a massive player, but it's not the only player. And that's why when people come in with symptoms and they're like, I'm really cold, I have headaches, my body temperature, I'm not sleeping, doesn't necessarily mean thyroid problem. Could just mean maybe they're anemic, because that looks just like anemia too. Could be maybe they're just not eating enough. Maybe they're B12 deficient. Maybe they're zinc deficient. Any of those players could result in that very similar symptoms. And so getting back to just the thyroid in general, if you go to your doctor and they still tell you you're normal and all your numbers are correct, it doesn't mean that your thyroid is getting where it needs to go. That's the caveat to all this. It's just kind of one piece of the equation, because ultimately your doctors are measuring what's in your blood, and your blood is just the transportation system. It's just sending everything everywhere. It doesn't tell you what's going on in your cell, or if it's even getting in your cell, because that's the only thing that really matters. What is happening in the cell is that T3 getting in there to tell the system to work appropriately. And we don't really know. One other test they can do is reverse T3. And the reverse T3 can give you some insight if it's elevated, that it could be that your body, anytime a body is under stress, if or in a high cortisol state, the initial response of your physiology and your pituitary and the TSH is to elevate, right? You have acute stress or short-term stress, the thyroid's going to go, hey, just make a bunch more thyroid. We have a stress going on. Let's make a lot more energy healthfully. That happens, and maybe your TSH will be elevated. However, if someone is in chronic state of stress or in it for a long period of time, then the body says, you know what, we can't keep up. So we're going to suppress your TSH and tell your body to downregulate energy production. And so if you went to your doctor and they're like, your TSH is in the right range, it could just be the question I would have, well, have you been under a severe amount of stress? Because if you have, your TSH is going to be suppressed. And if you have a suppressed TSH, it can look normal, but it's being suppressed because you're in that high stress state. So the lab numbers don't mean everything. There are more things that can result in a low thyroid state or a low metabolism state. So we have to kind of take all the little pieces and bring them together. It is one piece of the pie, but yes, it gets confusing because the thyroid lab numbers don't tell you everything. We do need to take things like symptoms into consideration. And that's why, getting back to temperature and pulse, using temperature and pulse is a very easy way to monitor how well your thyroid or your metabolism is functioning. Because when you are producing energy well, you will have more heat production. So your body is warmer. So simply getting a thermometer and taking your temperature upon waking, and then after you eat, will give you guidance on what your body's doing. Food should warm you up. If it doesn't, if you wake up and then you eat and your body temperature drops, it means that you were waking up in a stress state, and that the food is now kind of suppressing that heat production because it's lowering your stress hormones and it's cooling you off. So I kind of go into, there's like a lot of different theories on what is happening. I do touch on all of those, like in my book, about what is exactly going on. But using temperature can be a really effective approach in trying to understand, am I producing energy effectively? Most people are running at a very low body temperature in today's world. In fact, they're so much so that they think that they should change the ideal body temperature to like 97.8 because everybody's low. And when you start using this approach and fixing things, you notice that, oh, no, I can actually get my body temperature up. I want it to be warmer. That means I'm producing more heat. I just want to make sure I'm eating enough nutrition and food to support that. Because if you improve energy production, you got to keep giving your body the resources to keep that going.
Mhm. Do you recommend under the tongue or under the armpit, taking the temperature?
Personally, I tell people under the tongue, just because I think if you do it the armpit, it takes longer. I don't think most people have the patience. I think you need if you have a mercury thermometer and you want to do it under the armpit, it's probably the most effective and probably the most real. Most people don't have that. Most people have the digital thermometer. So, and most people want to do it in 10 seconds. So
Mhm.
my advice is normally get a thermometer that you can use consistently. Usually just stick it in your mouth to let it warm up a little bit for maybe 30 seconds and then turn it on. Put it deep inside underneath your tongue. Don't put it right at the top. Go deep inside your mouth and just sometimes take it once or twice to just make sure that you're not getting crazy numbers. It is a tool. It isn't an absolute truth, right? So use it as a tool. I always say if you want to use the armpit, I'm fine with that. It will be a little bit cooler than oral. So usually guess that it's going to be about a half a degrees cooler if you do your armpit.
Okay. And so what temperature are you looking for? Let's go with oral. What temperature are you looking for upon waking? Are you looking for 97.8?
Yeah, that's a good place. Yeah, 97.8 to 98.6 is all fine. I mean, these are averages or norms. If you're a cycling woman, you might be cooler the first part of your cycle. Usually in the follicular phase for women, you are going to be a little bit cooler. And then once you ovulate, your temperature normally will drop up or jump up a half a degree to a degree because of the progesterone. So know that your temperature will adjust. But yes, for most healthy individuals, 97.8 Fahrenheit. And then you want to get up to about 98.6 during the day or 37 degrees Celsius.
Mhm. Personally, my experience with taking my temperature was that I was just able to see a numeric manifestation of my symptoms. Like on the mornings when I was like, wow, I woke up and I don't feel good. My temp was lower. In the
Hmm.
mornings when I woke up and I was like, wow, I feel good. I don't have brain fog. My temp was higher. So it's like I tend to go more on symptoms, but I understand it's not everything, but I understand the benefits of having something to measure and seeing a pattern. And that's the problem with a lot of blood work is that you get a snapshot in time and then adios for a year. And so,
Mhm.
and it's like blood work only makes sense if you do it enough to see a pattern, just like taking your temperature or pulse only makes sense if you do it enough to see a pattern, and then you can
Mhm.
respond to that pattern and change it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I always tell people I want I got online and I paid for like two different panels, and each of them had cholesterol numbers in it. And I went and got and paid and went to the lab and get them done at the same visit. They drew from the same day blood, but they were two different panels. And the cholesterol numbers had a 20% change in those from the same blood. So you can imagine day to day, month to month, they're going to fluctuate based on a lot of different variables. So not saying labs are bad. I like to use labs, but for cost basis and for your own well-being and just to have other tools to see how you're doing, you can use those objective markers, right? And we can also use subjective markers, like how are you actually feeling? How did you sleep last night? How's your digestion? Are you having a normal bowel movement a couple times a day? Or are you constipated or loose stool? Or are you having bloating? These are all things to pay attention to. For women, it's like, how's your cycle? Is it every 28 to 30 days? Do you have a lot of cramping or heavy bleeding, right? All of those things that we pay attention to because your cycle is going to tell you a lot about your health, your brain fog. I mean, any of these are symptomatically things we pay attention to because as your body gets healthier, those things will just get better.
Mhm. Um, okay, there's something that people talk about a lot, this idea of metabolic flexibility. I had
Mhm.
someone recently tell me, "Oh, I became metabolically flexible when I started intermittent fasting."
Mm.
And I thought that was interesting. The idea, or at least the conventional idea of metabolic flexibility is like I can use carbs when I need them and I can use fat when I need them. And so I'm a good fat burner and I'm a carb burner depending on the context. Is that what you would describe as metabolic flexibility? And do you think that restriction can lead to metabolic flexibility? It seems like it's the opposite.
So it's a good question. I mean, I guess my theory is that, yeah, you want to be able to use both fuel sources effectively. And the thing
Right.
is that most people are using both carbs and fat all the time. You're never just a carb burner. You're never just a fat burner. You
Mhm.
tend to use more carbohydrates when you're in more activity or you're more stressed, and you tend to use a higher percentage of fat when you're sleeping or more at rest. Each one of your cells can use either. They just can't use them both at the same time. So it's a matter of which cells are going to function more optimally using carbs at some point in time and which ones are going to use fat. And from our perspective, a lot of what your body does that needs quick energy is going to want to use more carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are going to be metabolized a lot quicker, a lot faster. So like your nervous system, like we talked about, other organs, and things are going to be able to utilize carbohydrates more effectively.
So you were talking about metabolic flexibility and that we should be able to use carbs well and fat well. And most people, and we are doing that. I mean, we are, if we're not doing it
Yeah.
well, we're doing it.
Yeah, and I think what happens to most people, as you become more under stress and your body starts trying, right? Like we have to remember what stress is. Stress is on becomes on the body anytime the demands on the body exceed what your body can produce energy for, right? So demands are high and you can't produce the energy to keep up with that. You will elicit a stress response. Every time you elicit a stress response, then your body is going to break down tissue or release glucose or manufacture glucose. And it's also going to break down fat and dump it in your blood. So you're going to have free fatty acids and glucose dumped in your blood. Now, if you do that excessively over time, something happens called the Randle cycle, where your body tendency has a preference to use fat or carbs. So if you have a high fat state, the tendency is it's going to try to use the fat over the carbohydrates. And when you're in a chronically stressed position, your body's going to, again, release tons of fat and sugar into the blood. So what tends to happen to these individuals is they are in this chronic state, and it actually continues to turn on. So even when there's fuel available, meaning they have plenty of fuel in their blood, they have high blood sugar, they have high fat in the blood. The problem is it can't get into the cell or through the cell, so they don't produce energy effectively. So the feedback is we need more. So the body actually stays in this low level stress state even when the fuel is available. And that continually dumps more fat and more sugar into the blood, right? And that's kind of what a diabetic looks like. They are chronically high blood sugar and high fat. We don't measure the free fatty acids in their blood, but they would be high. And again, when that happens, the sugar is like competing with that excessive amount of fat in the blood, and it cannot get into the cell. And the body would actually prefer, because it wants that quicker energy, because it's now under stress, because it doesn't produce enough energy, and just this whole cycle continues. And so when that happens, that's when you would say you do not have good metabolic flexibility. You eat these foods and it's just like a shit show. You have high fat, high sugar. So what some people do is like, well, if I remove all the carbohydrates and I just have fat, yes, on some level, your body will start using the fat better because the sugar is out of the way. And so the body will just start metabolizing fat. The problem with that scenario is your body always needs glucose. And so if you aren't giving it any, then the body has to stay in that stress response to make its own. And so, yes, we're sort of fixing it. And depending on the other reasons why that person might be metabolically inflexible, meaning if they just have fatty liver or a lot of visceral fat around the organs, which could possibly inhibit how well they're utilizing the glucose, and maybe they lose weight or lose some visceral fat, that could improve their flexibility because of that variable. And so, but ultimately, usually when someone removes all carbohydrates from their diet and they try to add them back in, they usually don't use them very well. They actually will produce some level of insulin resistance because they haven't needed insulin. And so the insulinic response is usually quite slow when they add the carbs back in. So usually when those individuals, someone from a keto or carnivore space, starts adding carbs back in, they have really high blood sugar numbers. And usually over time that can be corrected. but the body has to learn how to become essentially more flexible again. And one route to do that is actually the other way you could go. Instead of eliminating the carbohydrates, is you put them on a very low fat diet and you allow their body to become more sensitive to the glucose because you've removed the fat out of their diet. And that will help improve. And that's why there's many, many dietary approaches that have a very, very low fat diet will fix the diabetic state, and they'll actually do it better than a very low carbohydrate state because they actually fix the problem, meaning the body ends up becoming more insulin sensitive after you expose it to a lot of carbohydrates, so that slowly they might be able to like increase their fat intake and be just fine. But again, that's deciding if that's the reason, because it could just be that they need better nutrition and that could help fix the problem. It could be that maybe they had a lot of gut issues and an increased level of endotoxins, and that was the issue. So there's multiple issues that could be actually blocking their body's ability to produce energy. So we kind of have to do a little investigation to figure out what that essentially is. But that would create more metabolic flexibility. And I always say to people, I go, look, when you become a really good carbohydrate burner, you will actually become a really good fat burner in the rested state because your metabolism will be really high. And when you have a high running metabolism at rest, you will burn more calories, and at rest, you will burn more fat.
This is super interesting. I talked about this with Jay Feldman when we did our first interview together, and he mentioned an article by Denise Menger,
Mm-hmm.
who wrote, I think, the case for low fat, and
Mm-hmm.
talks about all of these physicians and scientists who are healing diabetes with really, really high sugar diets, including white sugar. And it's just a fascinating article. And it's basically about what you're describing, is that you have to make the cells, you can't avoid what they're doing wrong. Like you have to make them
You
more
have to
sensitive
expose
to
them.
glucose,
Yeah.
expose
You,
them.
yeah, there's some level of exposure without overly exposure. Because I think a lot of people get this approach and they come from a higher fat, high protein diet. And then all of a sudden they just add a bunch of carbs in without addressing the amount of fat that they've just consumed. And they do not get a good response because now they're high carb and high fat. And now those two things are competing, and they tend to all of a sudden get super high blood sugars. They gain a ton of weight and they're like, this doesn't work. And so it is kind of dependent on, some people can just add them in slowly. Some people need to address other things that might be going on. But ultimately, most people normally feel better when you can get them to a more carb-centric approach if they've been on like a keto-based or carb-based diet or a low-carb-based diet for quite some time. Because normally you start to see that they're getting a little bit colder. They don't respond to stress as well as they used to. And so they have to kind of move over so they can kind of feel better. And the way they're going to do that is just by adding more carbohydrates.
You know what else is interesting? In the functional medicine space, I think people are really obsessed with wearing continuous glucose monitors. And they don't really have this concept of taking your temperature or taking your pulse. Versus in the pro-metabolic space, I don't ever really hear people talk about using continuous glucose monitors or measuring your blood sugar. It's just super fascinating, because one group is really looking at the blood sugar and what's it doing? Is it going too high? Is it changing a lot? Um, and then the other group is on temperature. Do you see any value in measuring blood sugar? And I understand that if you have been eating a higher fat diet, the introduction of carbs and the lowering of fat needs to be gradual, as you've mentioned, because otherwise your body's going to be like, well, what what it's like giving a car a brand new source of gasoline, and it's never had it before. You got to go slow, whatever, something like that. So what do you think about continuous glucose monitors?
So I think they have a place. I think they're being overutilized and they're making people neurotic, to be honest with you. And I think when we got, certainly we got obsessed with the fact of high blood glucose, and that if we can monitor your high blood glucose and pull your blood glucose numbers down, then you're going to feel better. And that's not inherently wrong. Certainly, people that don't have a good response to blood sugar, the fallacies in all of that is it's not fixing anything. Because what everyone's essentially doing is they start just eating less carbs. And if you eat less carbs, you're not going to have any glucose spikes, which is true. You're going to have way less. And so, and for some people, that's going to feel better, right? They're not rebounding all over the place. It's not fixing how well they utilize carbs, though, which is what you inherently want. That's where the money is. And so they're kind of giving it like a patchwork on some level. And, I think some of the benefits to that thought process is people are learning to kind of make sure they're eating some protein with each meal, make sure they're having a little fat with each meal, and make sure your meals are somewhat balanced, maybe have better food choices. I think those are all decent thought process, but to be so fearful of a blood sugar spike or increases in blood sugar, I think is a really bad approach, because sometimes you do have higher blood sugar numbers. You might have a very hard carbohydrate meal. And if it's very infrequent, it's not where you are, then there's no problems with that. And so if we get stuck with that, then we start to get into the obsessive space again, that it's like being on a scale all the time. And these CGMs are giving you a reading like every 5 minutes, and for some people, if I was to jump on a scale every 5 minutes, it's going to make me crazy. And so I see that with people, they get so fearful of carbohydrates then, because they're like, oh my God, look, that just raised it. I can't eat that then. And then like, I don't know what to eat. I'm starving and I have a headache and I feel like I want some carbohydrates, but if I eat that, my blood sugar goes up and that makes me, and so they just get in these spins that don't know where to go because they're eating based on what this CGM is saying versus what their body is actually telling them. And so when we're using all these external resources to try to tell us what to do, again, not saying it cannot be used as a tool, and I have certainly used it with some specific clients that we need that information for, but it should not be used for everyone. And it shouldn't, and if you aren't sensitive to kind of these outside resources making you a little bit nuts, then get rid of it, because it's just creating more stress in a life that we're trying to not do to you. Right. And so we have to kind of be very conscious of how we're kind of treating our body. And maybe on some levels, we need to be more back in our bodies and say, hey, maybe I should just listen to my own body's signals and what it's telling me versus all these external things that are saying like what I should be doing.
Right, that makes sense. And then, like you said, it's inevitable that your blood sugar is gonna go up when you eat, and that's healthy. That's a sign of somebody who's alive. And
That's right. Yeah, I mean, you don't want your blood sugar up at 180, 200 all the time, right? I mean, that
right.
is not a decent response. And certainly if you think you are having blood sugar issues, it might give us some insight initially about what's going on with you. But we're just using it as a tool and it's not an absolute. And then we're going to focus on other things so that we can pay attention to how your body's responding. Then we're going to base, things on your energy and your sleep and all of those things, because that's really what's important, right? If I flatline your blood glucose and you feel like total garbage, then what's the point? There's no point to that.
Right. At the end of the day, it's like measure what you want to measure, but how do you feel? It's like, do you feel energy? Do you have energy? Do you feel optimistic? And it takes energy to feel optimistic. It takes energy.
100%.
Yeah. Well,
Hmm.
yeah, but Ray Peat talked about this, this learned helplessness, like this kind of stagnation, lethargic, like it's so much easier to life is so much easier when you have energy. And I know that sounds so obvious, except like we're talking cellular energy is like literally fueling life and your optimism and your,
Hmm.
desire to live.
Yeah, I mean, I think when people are in that survival mode or in a stressed position, they can only see what is going to keep them alive. They can't see past that. And so
Mhm.
there might, when it comes down to your mental state, then there's nothing that you can see. So the optimism could be kind of gray because there's just, I can't see past survival mode right now. And when you start to fuel the system and the body is more capable of producing energy for everything, you actually then feel better and you don't feel like a stressed out maniac all the time, then your body's going to actually allow you to have deeper thoughts, more expansion, right? All of those things are opening to you, but we can't do it in this survival state. It's just not going to be open to you.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the things that I observe with myself, with my lineage, particularly my maternal lineage, is that I really feel like I was born to such a depleted lineage. Like my
Hmm.
mama, very depleted. I think very, archetypal, kind of like thin and stressed out and doesn't need to eat, and like, and my
Hmm.
grandmother as well. And so we are born already with like our bank account of life force is already kind of small. That's already so many people, I guess we're starting out life already stressed. And so all of this becomes even more important. We talk
Hmm.
about transgenerational nutrient
Hmm.
deficiencies and inheriting like a really survival based hormonal blueprint from mother and father, but particularly mother. And so it's like all this is even more important from the modern person because we're really, I mean, we have to regenerate for many of us, very depleted lineage.
Hmm. I think that we know that, the health of your grandmother can tell you the health of her grandbaby, right?
Hmm.
And so if there is, like you said, it's a very stressed or depleted kind of, that is certainly going to affect the possibly the grandbaby, right? The baby that your grandmother held, you were literally an egg in your mother in your grandmother, right? So
Right.
every baby is born with all the eggs it's going to have its entire life already, right? At birth, I think there's like 1 or 2 million eggs in the baby. So you're already there and you were in your grandmother. But most people are like, if someone's sick, it's like, well, it's genetic. And I'm like, well, maybe. Or it's because your parent was ill and malnourished and stressed, and that physiology is now yours because it has the same cellular kind of energy going into it. And so now
Right.
you're just working at a deficient state. And so, can we improve that? Yeah, I think it's very possible. Certainly, the younger, the better. But I think it be improved at any age. Some people, yeah, you're just coming out already in a deficient state. And I don't know if it's because you're genetically, that's what you're given. It's because if we probably go back and look at your mother when she was pregnant or her life or how it was, there's probably clues in there that says, yeah, she was a dieter whole her life, right? She wanted to be thin all her life. She was totally stressed out her whole life. Kid that affected you? Sure, 100%.
Totally. My maternal grandmother was the youngest of 10, a very poor family, alcoholic father, married really young, had a lot of kids also. Just I think being even just the youngest of 10, by the time you're the 10th child of the same mama, you her nutrient stores, even as tough as our great grandmothers were,
Yep.
her mama's nutrient stores were depleted. So,
Hmm.
um, it's yeah, it's really fascinating, but it's quite the task. It's quite the task to incarnate into a modern body because are having to rectify some like several generations of like damaged metabolism.
Yeah, on some level. Yeah. I mean, there just can be some cellular issues going on that's going to affect the generations to come. And,
Uh-huh.
hopefully I have hope in this generation because I do think there is people that are like, you know what? I'd rather be healthy and strong versus thin and, all the stuff. And I want to support my system for me to basically be able, I mean, because, infertility has become a major problem. And
Right.
for me to have a healthy baby, I have to support my system. And if I don't, then that's not going to happen, or the baby's going to struggle. And I think with this world of information everywhere, if you get into the right spaces, it can be quite beneficial because we do have this information now. So it's there for our conscious levels to go, oh, and I can actively make these decisions. And I've seen it over and over again with women who have kind of struggled to get pregnant, and they start to follow this approach, and then they can get pregnant and have a healthy baby because now their body has the tools and the resources to do that. Your body doesn't want to procreate if you are unable to produce enough energy to keep you alive. It's not going to let you get pregnant, right? It's not even thinking about that. And so it's going to be a struggle. So we have to support it to give you enough fuel and energy to produce a human.
Right. We want to be so healthy that our babies are healthy. We want,
Exactly.
yeah, we want to be so metabolically, you know, energetic that our babies have beautiful high functioning cells. Um,
100%.
so okay, before there's just a few other things I want to touch on before we part ways because
Yeah.
you are so knowledgeable. So I've spoken about this pro-metabolic, you know, way of eating and really living quite a bit. And I've had a lot of people say, oh, but haven't you read that book, Fasting? I think it's called Fasting Like a Girl or Fasting for Women by Dr. Mindy. Don't you know that fasting really is good for us? It's just you have to do it at the right time in our cycle.
Mm.
So that's one thing. Let's touch there, and then I have another kind of follow up to that.
Okay. So are you asking me, is fasting
Oh yeah.
necessary?
Well, I guess what I'm asking is to respond to, yeah, is fasting necessary and maybe responding to this idea of like fasting according to our cycle, that fasting is an appropriate tool for us and something that we should definitely incorporate into our lives. We just have to do it at the right time in our cycle.
Mm. Yeah, so there's no evidence of that. Zero evidence of that. So that is something I believe that specific doctor maybe has utilized in her clinic. Maybe that's her own findings. I don't know. What I can tell you about fasting, putting yourself in a state of starvation and not eating, considering we're talking about how to function, right? When we don't eat, we are initially going to put ourselves in a stress position. We don't eat, your adrenaline, your cortisol, that's what's going to happen. That's what's going to run the show at that point in time. So can people do fasting effectively here and there if they're healthy? Sure. Do I recommend it? Not really. I don't know what the point is. I mean, you can get all the benefits of fasting just by not eating while you're sleeping, right? Everyone throws around words like autophagy. We need to clean up our system. We do it a longer period of time. You go into autophagy when you are sleeping. If you want to continue to not eat, will it increase autophagy? Sure. But basically, the reason is because the cleanup, which is cellular cleanup, is what autophagy is. The cleanup increases because the breakdown also continues, right? You're breaking down more things when you're not eating because you have to break down you to fuel your system. So yes, autophagy will increase, but it's kind of the equivalent of saying, I'm going to go mess up my room just so I can clean it up more. It doesn't really make sense, in my opinion. Now, if you love to fast and you feel good fasting and it's something you enjoy doing, then by all means, go for it. But does a woman inherently need to fast? No. And most women, specifically in the perimenopausal, menopausal years, I don't think actually do well on fasting at all because they need additional support. They need to regulate their blood sugar more. They need a ton more nutrition. When you're not eating, you're not getting nutrients. So, and when you're not eating, you're not getting fuel to fuel your system. So it can feel a little bit stressful. And I talk to a ton of women, some like it and they can use it effectively. I think a lot of people like about it, they're like, it's just easy because I can only eat once a day. Like if I intermittent fast, I eat one time a day and I don't have to think about things. And for those reasons, they tend to like it and it kind of kills their appetite. But usually, again, something really stressful happens in their life and everything goes to shit and they can no longer do that. And then they overeat and they put all that weight back on anyways. So in the context of most women's cycles and what they need, your cycle needs an immense amount of fuel, an immense amount of nutrients to function optimally. And so voiding yourself of that, regardless of what time the cycle is, doesn't make any sense to me. And usually during the latter part of your cycle, your luteal phase, you do need more calories and usually more carbohydrates. So I think Dr. Mindy does stress that, and it's just physiologically because it's a increased demand. You are developing your endometrial lining. That is an energy issue. You need more fuel to do that. And that's why women have cravings during that time of the cycle. They maybe have sweet cravings. They maybe feel like they need to eat more. It's like, yeah, because you have this increased demand on your body. It requires more nutrition at this point in time. Your metabolism is actually increased at this point in time. That's why your body temperature elevates. So you will need more calories. So whether you decide to, back off your workout or do whatever you want during that workout, it doesn't really matter. If you're healthy, you can do whatever workout you want at any time of the cycle, whenever you want. And if you support yourself energetically, none of this other stuff matters, in my opinion. If you like fasting though, and it works for you, go for it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. Great response. And talking about menopause briefly, because it's a huge topic, but I did recently have a woman write me a really long email like, everything you're saying about carbs and all these things, it doesn't apply to menopausal women because our metabolism slows down and we put on weight and we do better with, a low carb diet. And I guess so many women in their menopausal years do put on a lot of weight that they find undesirable and do feel more sluggish. But it's almost like those are manifestations of an accumulation of many years of a lot of stress, lack of nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. So menopausal symptoms, I mean, people will talk about in many cultures and traditionally there wasn't a word for menopause, or if there was, it had a positive connotation. There wasn't this idea of menopause symptoms being something terrible that like truly upset your life. And so I don't know if you want to briefly comment on menopause as a life stage and a rite of passage, and if it's really true that a pro-metabolic diet is a too high carb for a menopausal woman.
Yeah, definitely heard all that. I went through menopause 2 years ago, and I consume a high carb diet, and so I would disagree. And most of the women I work with, I deal with primarily perimenopausal or menopausal women. I usually get them on a high carb diet. And again, it's different for everybody because I wouldn't just throw everybody on massive high carbs. It depends on that individual where we're starting at. But it's certainly the reason I think that menopausal women say this, and I know their experience is real, is that they eat more carbs. They definitely don't metabolize them. We see more insulin resistance and prediabetes in perimenopausal, menopausal women. But all those are symptoms of a body that is unable to produce energy effectively. And when you go through the menopausal transition, which is very real, and your body stops producing ovarian, estradiol, and progesterone, it's an additional stress on the system because progesterone is quite protective, and both those hormones kind of have a job that they're no longer doing. You're no longer having a cycle, so your body just says, well, we don't need those anymore. You're no longer going to have a baby. We're going to stop producing those. That can come from a body under additional stress. So it's the accumulation factor, in my opinion, that woman is experiencing outside of actually the ovarian shift that is creating a lot of the symptoms of what her body is experiencing. Because if a woman is, whether they're not eating enough or not producing energy effectively, they are going to have way more perimenopausal symptoms than somebody that is eating enough calories, working out effectively, getting enough sleep. They're going to have virtually no symptoms. So is that then, what are we supposed to say about that? Well, the variable that's different is what person one that feels better during perimenopause is actually eating enough, supporting their systems. So the actual shift that they're experiencing internally isn't affecting them that much. But if the body is already fragile, and now you're having this hormonal shift within it, the feelings that they're going to experience are going to be far more extreme. And that's what we see with most women, right? And so at that point of time, they become less sensitive to glucose because for every reason we've already talked about is because they're in that stress cycle. And so for them, because now they're like, oh my God, I'm gaining weight. I'm not all the carbohydrates now I'm using are elevating my blood sugar. I'm unable to use them. So I'm just storing them. I'm gaining all this belly fat. Yeah, all a true experience. However, it's not just because menopause, though. There's a bigger thing going on within your body that you're missing that nobody is talking about. And if we can correct that, then we won't experience this. But it's not just as easy as going, oh, I'm going to add a bunch of carbs into my diet, because there could be other factors that are inhibiting why you're unable to utilize glucose appropriately. And that's what we have to get to the bottom of. But ultimately, that is why women will end up getting on a low carb approach, because they do become less insulin sensitive, and they become more glucose intolerant. And so they get on a low carb, they do feel better because, yeah, if you're having constantly high blood sugar, that doesn't feel good. Yet it doesn't help them long term. Eventually, they're not going to feel as good. And then they become more symptomatic. So then the next option is they're just going to get on hormone replacement therapy. And that will also help them feel better initially until they have to increase it more and more and more. So, and that's just kind of like a whole nother can of worms that we probably shouldn't get into this discussion, because there's so much information and what is the right path there and so forth. But ultimately, it certainly, there are tons of menopausal women that consume high carbohydrate diets that we can improve insulin sensitivity to, that can utilize carbohydrates more effectively, and don't need to be, and then end up feeling better and sleeping better and so forth. And that's what I'm looking forward to. And it isn't, like I said, just as easy as just eat carbs and that's all going to be fixed. We have to adjust and look at other things to make sure that we're not going to put you in a position where you are going to gain more weight. Because it is true, if they are in that state, they don't respond well to carbohydrates. So we can't just throw a bunch of carbs in there and hope for the best. We want to do it in a way that improves their sensitivity so that they don't experience all the negative effects.
Mhm. Yeah, understood. Totally. The menopausal, component is a whole nother ballgame. Hey, I know you're writing another book. Is it about menopause?
No, but that would be a good. It probably talks a little bit about that. I talk. The next book will be. It's a lot. I go to it in a lot more depths about all these kind of things that affect energy production, and like, so that people can have a deeper understanding of what really is going on in their body. And then I go into a deeper understanding of all the blocks or things that kind of can affect it. Because I think if people can understand those things better, then they can become better health kind of detectives with their own systems. It's not, again, telling you what to eat. It's helping you understand your system better from the perspective of energy production.
Mhm.
And so the first book was certainly very food focused, and it goes from that perspective. And
Mhm.
this one will be very like biology, trying to make it not hard to understand perspective, right? And that's been kind of the challenge, but we're getting there, or I'm getting there. And so hopefully by the beginning of summer, I'm hoping it will be done.
That's awesome. I'm going to share with people the link to your website, also to your Instagram. Your Instagram is fabulous. You're always sharing highly educational content in an easy to absorb way. So I appreciate that. We do have some English speakers as well, and some bilingual people, and I always try to share your work and cite you as a source because it's so important. And I'm very much hoping that we can get your book published in Spanish, because I think it would be a great service to the Spanish speaking community. And yeah, it's amazing. Is there any kind of closing thoughts, anything that you wanted to kind of say or tell people before we say goodbye?
Just that, like, go in slowly to this approach. My book
Mhm.
will give you a easy understanding of this if you could get in there and understand it. And it is like, look, don't try to do everything at once. Pick a few things. and start there and see this as this is not like try to get to the finish line as quick as possible. This is a try things, see how they feel, and adjust slow and steady. That's usually the best route for your health. Your body doesn't like these big shocks, you can shift it with food, and it is there, and it doesn't have to be complicated, but it can feel complicated, especially when you're looking at your own health because we psychoanalyze ourselves. But the book will help you quite a bit.
Yes, it's such a great tool. I'm hoping we get in Spanish one day. I will help you make that happen any way that I can. And thank you so much for your time and for your energy.
You are
It's
welcome, Katie.
yes,
Pleasure.
I'm so grateful. And thank you everybody for listening. And make sure to check below the video for all the important links. Thank you. Bye, Kate.
Bye.